Do what? That might be a good way to get people to sit toward the back. Well, we had some interferences on Wednesday night, and we haven't been able to look at the book of Ruth, with the exception of the first part of chapter 1. And when you read, very short book, and when you read the book of Ruth, and I think I indicated this in one of our classes, that when the eventual separation took place between Ruth, Orpah, and Naomi, of course all of them did not go back to their respective homes. But when Naomi told them that they needed to go back to their homes, you might say, that Ruth had probably several different reasons for not going back. But in verse number 16 of chapter 1, we're told that Ruth said, "Entreat me not to leave thee, or to return from following after thee. For whither thou goest, I will go, and where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God. Where thou diest will I die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if aught but death part thee and me." When she saw that she was steadfastly minded to go with her, then she left speaking unto her. That one statement, and I may have mentioned this, I know I mentioned part of it the last time we looked at it, that quite often these verses are used in wedding ceremonies. And to me, they are very strong to use in a situation like that. And from the words as we have them recorded for us, and let's read that verse number 18 this way. When Naomi saw that Ruth was steadfastly minded to go with her, then she left speaking unto her. Now that would take strong language, wouldn't it? Can any of us remember a long time ago when we were younger and we begged for something? It might have been to stay with Granny, or it might have been for any number of things. And as we look back on it in retrospect, we look at how pitiful we became in things like that. That's the situation here. Where you see, these women had experienced so much together. Probably in a little more than 10 years. These three women had experienced more than some people experience in a lifetime, especially Naomi, because she lost a husband by death. She lost sons by death. Orpah and Ruth lost husbands. And I see behind all of this, now if you go back into chapter 1, to me this is made known. Now no other commentator but me indicates this. But I'm thinking in terms of the lineage that would be left by the descendants of Naomi. Maddie and I, when we were coming to the church building, got to talking about this. And if you had to work up a family tree, you couldn't work it up completely, but a family tree pertaining to David. Now, Boaz would be in that family tree. Because in Matthew chapter 1, I believe it's about verse 5, we have outlined for us the descendancy to David and to eventually Christ. Boaz was the great-grandfather to David. And they lived separated by a great number of years. But Boaz is listed in that line of descendancy. And when you look at the overall picture of the book of Ruth, that becomes even more pronounced. And again, to me, it sheds light on the providential care that God has been concerned about throughout the history of humanity. That we see all of these things that transpire following an order. Now, man couldn't do that. It would be an impossibility for humanity to do what God has done for us with His Word. And we see that emphasized here in this statement that was made by Ruth. That word entreat that introduces verse 16 just simply means that Ruth is saying, I am begging you to let me stay with you. Where you go, I want to go. Where you die, I want to die. Where you're buried, I want to be buried. Many poets. Now, I know all of you read Browning and Tennyson and all of these outstanding poets. But the two Brownings did a lot of their writings from scriptural messages. And one of those that involves, how do I love you? Let me count the ways. You know where the inspiration of that came from? Right here in Ruth, chapter 1. And that's true of so many of the writings. Maddie gave me the job of picking out some birthday cards, anniversary cards, thank you cards, and so I picked up this one card. And I know what many of you, well, a card's a card. Just get a card. You don't have to read all of them. But there was a statement from one of the poems of Tennyson. Live this day as if it were your last. It could well be the last. We say, boy, that is surely simple, isn't it? But what about the reality of it? It could be. It could be. And we turn to the scriptures and we find the indications of that. So many statements that we could find upon the pages of God's Word that would direct us toward matters like that. So then, after Naomi sees that Ruth is determined to stay with her, in verse 19, the two of them go back to Bethlehem. Now, this is in Judah, or as it is now called, Judea. And it came to pass when they were come to Bethlehem that all the city was moved about them, and they said, Is this Naomi? Have you ever wondered why that question was asked? They didn't know her. Now, why didn't they know her? It's the same Naomi that left.
Changed.
Pardon?
She had changed.
Why had she changed?
All the bitterness she suffered.
All right. She had suffered for a while in a famine. Then her husband died. Then her sons died. They go to Moab because they know that there's not a famine in Moab. And here she is with the responsibility of, you might say, caring for these young women. And when the time comes for her and Ruth to go back to the city of Bethlehem, when they arrive, the people, she may have grown up with a lot of these people. And now they're asking, is that you? I went in a convenience store yesterday, and I saw this man coming through the door, and I thought when he came, I said, I know that man. I know him. And I mean, it has been years since I have seen him, if it's who I thought it was. So when he comes in, I meet him, and I say, hello, Billy, how are you? He said, who are you? He said, how do you know me? I said, I knew your mother and daddy. I knew your sister Patsy. I knew a bunch of your relatives. He said, are you one of the Gooch boys? I said, yes, sir. The first time I had seen him in years and years and years. And I still recognized him. But now, he didn't recognize me. We're about the same age. We're pretty close to the same age. But we change, don't we? My daddy told me in his working days that usually the men that he worked around were wearing a cap or a hat of some kind. It might be a hard hat, or it might just be an old, if the government hadn't got a hold of it, but then you might be wearing a normal cap or hat. And Daddy said, I'll see men, if they hadn't got a hat or a cap or a hard hat, I don't know who they are. We see notable people trying to describe. Let's take actresses and actors. They'll put on a cap, they'll put on dark glasses, they'll change their hairstyle in some way, and we say, oh, you'll never fool me. But yeah, you will be fooled too. It makes that much difference. In this situation, after all that Naomi had been through, she doesn't go to a distant country. She goes back to her homeland. She goes back to where she came from, you might say. And they ask, is this Naomi? Now look at that next verse. And she said unto them, call me not Naomi, but call me Mara. Why? For the Almighty hath dealt very bitterly with me. Now that statement that is made here, that God hath dealt very bitterly with her, is not to be taken in a negative sense. Naomi is not saying that all of this has happened to me because I have done something that God does not approve of. Why do we get old? All right, and who affects it?
Who affects it?
Yeah, God does, doesn't he? God does. As in Adam, all die. So then in Christ shall all be made alive. Now, as in Adam, all die. This is one of few verses that has both the physical and the spiritual application made in it. The first part is physical. And this goes back to the relationship that God had with Adam and Eve in the garden. I had a man ask me one time, if Adam and Eve had not transgressed God's commandment, would they be alive today? Would they have ever died? I don't know. But my thinking is, if that verse is correct that Paul wrote to the Corinthians, nobody would ever die. But what would we have? We'd have a perfect universe, wouldn't we?
Heaven on earth.
Yeah, right, heaven on earth. Everybody would be perfect. Now, who's the only perfect person who's ever lived? You see, if it was a utopian state, which just simply means that things are perfect. There's no blemish about it. Everything is perfect. If that were the case, there would have been no need. Here's Adam and Eve living in the Garden of Eden. They don't transgress the commandment of God. Therefore, they're going to live forever. And we look at Adam and Eve and we say, boy, I'm going to do what they did. And sure enough, we do. And the results are the same. We're perfect. What would that have done in prophecy and otherwise pertaining to the Son of God being the Lamb of God that takes away the sins of the world? There wouldn't have been any. Really, there would have been no need for God to sacrifice his Son if everything was perfect. God didn't sacrifice Christ, his Son, only begotten, for perfection, but for the imperfect. And here we see in these verses that Naomi is saying that God hath dealt very bitterly with me. These things that have naturally happened. I tell you, I get so upset every day when I watch the news and see our political leaders and hopeful leaders that have such a disregard for God and for the power of God in things. There was this political figure on TV, I believe it was the day before yesterday, and this average, ordinary citizen asked him, said, do you believe that nature is controlled by God? Do you know what that politician said? No, man is a law unto himself. You know what he is? He's a humanist. I wouldn't vote for him. There's no way that I would vote for him. Because the founding fathers included in the foundational document that they were what they were, and we can be what we can become as a result of the nature of God. Nothing else. The nature of God. So here we have Naomi, if I can use this term, who has been a victim of all of these things, and she's not begrudging that. It is simply a statement of fact. That word, well, my little green book gives two pronunciations for M-A-R-A, Marah and Mara. That word is used, I believe, if I didn't write that down. I believe 5 different times in the Old Testament. Spelled 5 different ways, but it means the same thing. And on 2 of those occasions, it was in the lifetime of Moses, when he had led the people of Israel. They had crossed the Red Sea, and I believe 3 days journeying. They couldn't find any water. Of course, they were in a desert. One historian said they were about 50 miles away from any water. They had water 50 miles that way, and they were 3 days' journey. And assuming that they could travel 17 miles in a day, that'd be 51, wouldn't it? But close to 50. So they're removed from water 50 miles, and it's 50 miles to the next water. So they get to the water eventually, and they can't drink it. They're like these cowboys on these Western movies that are out here on the desert, and they travel and travel and travel and travel, and here's water. And they get to it, don't drink, poison. And you may see some bones lying around where evidently somebody didn't believe the sign. But they get to the water, the Israelites do, and they cannot drink it. What does God do? Moses, take that tree, throw it on the water, and it becomes sweet. One commentator, in referring to the water that was called bitter, calls it brackish. I went with my cousin, John David, who preaches at Alexander City. I believe it was a year after I graduated from high school. And we were going bass fishing. Back in those days, he's still a good fisherman, but back in those days, I mean, I told him one time, I said, you missed your calling. And we went up to this little creek that was called Kalijah. Had to have a certain bait. And we got to that water, and I thought, fish cannot live in this water. It was brackish, they called it. After we got out on the water and we'd fish for about an hour, I won't say we had a boatload of fish, that'd be a fisherman lie, but I mean, we caught fish. But the Bible commentator says that this water was brackish. It was not the kind of water you'd want to drink. And another said it was salty. Now, there may be substance to that, because the location of where they found this water was not far removed from the Dead Sea. And the influence of the Dead Sea might have been such that it influenced that pool of water that they were trying to drink from. But in this situation right here, Naomi says, don't you call me Naomi anymore. Do you know what the word Naomi means? Pleasant. Now, to drink a glass of salt water, would that be very pleasant? I know some of you like salt, but it'd be unpleasant to drink salt water. And it may be, now this is me making this projection on this verse, that when you see the contrast between what Naomi's name meant and what she wanted the people to call her, just shows the affliction that she was in. When Brother Chastain's granddaddy was in the hospital, I went over there to see him and got to the hospital, and it dawned on me, most of the time, if you don't know people working at the desk, they won't give you a room number if you don't have the full name. So I walk up to the desk, this lady said, "May I help you?" I said, "Yeah, I'm looking for a man by the name of Chastain." She said, "What's his first name?" I had no idea. I said, "Well, brother do?" Now I knew this lady was a member of the church. I said, "Well, brother Chastain do?" She said, "I tell you what, I'll give you the room number." But now, his first name, let me get this straight. I don't know if he's Jesse Wayne or Wayne Jesse. But in all of his legal things, he goes by Jesse. But everybody else calls him Wayne. Well, I didn't know who it was. And somebody might say, "Well, it doesn't make any difference." Does it make any difference to Brother Chastain? Well, sure it does. It made a difference here to Naomi. She knew what her name was. I don't know if she was named because she was a pleasant person. That must have been the reason. For some reason, she was given that name. And now, she's bitterly oppressed because of all of these things that have happened to her. Now, she gives the reason for it in that following verse, verse 21. She says, "I went out full, and the Lord hath brought me home again empty." And she did, didn't she? She suffered a lot. And she said, "Why then call ye me Naomi, seeing the Lord hath testified against me, and the Almighty hath afflicted me?" So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, with her, which returned out of the country of Moab. And they came to Bethlehem in the beginning of the barley harvest. Now that's a very apt closing to this chapter. I think you mentioned this last time we had a class, Brother Lovelace, about this being an indication that the famine was over in Bethlehem, Judah. Now we aren't told how, when, or why that Naomi was told about this, that the famine's over. You know, the same thing happened during the lifetime of Jacob. When Jacob's sons went down into Egypt to buy grain because of the famine, well, of course, provisions had already been made in Egypt because Joseph was in charge. They had 7 years of plenty. Then they would have the 7 lean years, preparation made in the years of plenty for the 7 years of famine. So when Jacob's family was in need, they came down to buy grain. In some way, they found out that the famine in Bethlehem, Judah, was over. Now they were not too, if you can get a map in your mind, or if you got pretty good maps in your Bible, and I know all of you will be able to see this map that I'm holding up here, but Bethlehem, Judah is right along here, west of the Dead Sea, just northwest of the Dead Sea. And then over on the eastern side is the land of Moab. Now, how far they went in to the land of Moab, we don't know. But in some manner, they must have heard that the famine was over. And sure enough, when she and Ruth get back to Bethlehem, Judah, then it is time for the barley harvest. And that gets us ready for chapter 2, to where we read of the introduction of Boaz. And Naomi had a kinsman of her husband's, a mighty man of wealth, of the family of Elimelech. Now, who was Elimelech? Husband to Naomi. And his name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabitess said unto Naomi, Let me now go to the field and glean ears of corn after him in whose sight I shall find grace. And she said unto her, Go, my daughter. Now, an assumption is made here on the part of Naomi that Ruth is my daughter. Now, we know not how old Naomi might have been. In her eyes, as we saw in chapter 1, she was beyond the age of reproduction. And it would appear that Ruth is taking upon herself the care of Naomi. And voluntarily, Ruth says that she's going out into the field to glean corn. After him in whose sight I shall find grace. Now, it's interesting that we're introduced to Boaz relative to Elimelech. And the very man that Ruth speaks about in verse 2 is that Boaz. And that word glean is quite interesting. I never will forget, me and my brother, I guess we were probably in junior high. Harlan Hill's daddy came to our house one day and asked me and my brother if we wanted to scrap cotton. If I had understood the meaning of scrap cotton, I wouldn't have made the decision. Mother and Daddy made the decision. Y'all are going to get out there and scrap cotton. And we didn't even know at that time what scrap cotton was, but you're going to help buy blue jeans and shirts and stuff for school. What was our responsibility, Brother Hayes? The scraps were left, weren't they? I mean, I don't know, maybe 2 times the cotton had been, I don't know. But there just wasn't a whole lot there to pick. That's what gleaning is. You see, the law was that even a sojourner or somebody not friendly to a certain people could not go out into a field, and we see the word harvest as opposed to gleaning. Harvesting was done initially. Let's say picking the corn. That was harvest. Then if you gleaned, you got what was left. I mean, if all of it wasn't picked, you could have what was left. In the Old Testament, I know we'll not have time to notice this tonight, but God established laws pertaining to harvesting of crops or gleaning, as it's called here, so that provisions primarily could be made for, well, there's my note, Robert. Don't forget the tag. that the law that God made was primarily for two groups of people, the widows and the orphans. And the landowners, when they planted their crops and then it came time for harvesting, they had to reserve every corner of their fields. One writer, and you don't find this scripturally, but the assumption is made by this commentator, that in all probability, 10% on each corner of a field was left. So if that fell assuming the four corners, that man would have to leave 40% of his crop when he harvested it. And he left it so that these orphans and widows could glean from it, that they could get the leftovers. And that's what Ruth is faced with here. But now notice how a transition takes place. In verse 3 we're told, and she, that is Ruth, went and came and gleaned in the field after the reapers. That is, the reapers went through, and if the interpretation be correct, contrasting harvesting and gleaning, then when these reapers had harvested the major portion of the crop, then Ruth went along and gleaned in the field behind them. And her help was to light on a part of the field belonging unto Boaz, who was of the kindred of Elimelech. Now that word help is interesting. One version has happenstance. That is, it just turned out. Circumstances turned out in such a manner that the land on which she gleaned was a field that belonged to Boaz. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said unto the reapers, The Lord be with you. And they answered him, The Lord bless thee. Do you see the foundation for this story to be successful? Everybody, it appears, that were involved in it had God as their foundation. And evidently, they didn't know each other that well, though they were kin. But here Boaz comes from Bethlehem out to this field, and he speaks to the reapers, and he entreats the Lord to be with them. And then they in turn answer and say, The Lord bless thee. Then said Boaz unto his servant that was set over the reapers, Whose damsel is this? And the servant that was set over the reapers answered and said, It is the Moabitish damsel that came back with Naomi out of the country of Moab. And she said, I pray you, let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves. So she came and hath continued even from the morning until now, that she tarried a little in the house. Now that's quite interesting, that she tarried a little in the house. She must have been a fast worker. That she was able not only to glean and to gather. And keep in mind, this wouldn't be the easiest task because these reapers had already gone over it. But she was so diligent in it, not only was she successful in that, but she had tarried a little while at the house. She didn't come to the field the same time the reapers did. I mentioned Harlan Hill. Did you ever know Harlan? Miss Hill, I can't even remember her first name. He was Beatrice, but I can't remember her first name. But that lady would get up and she'd cook breakfast. And she'd clean the kitchen up, come to the field and pick cotton. Leave in time to go to the house to fix lunch, clean up, come back to the field, and pick cotton till it was time to fix supper. Every time I read this about Ruth, I think of Miss Hill. That's what Ruth was doing. I mean, she was so dedicated to this, and to me, all of it falls under this level of a relationship between Naomi and Ruth. That evidently Ruth saw that Naomi, because of this affliction, as she called, she can't do all of this. So Ruth assumed that responsibility. And not only did she glean in the field, but she was so good at it that she tarried at the house. She didn't have to go to the field the same time that the reapers did. I've got a story just opposite that. An uncle of mine, when he and his brothers and sisters were growing up, they'd go to the field, and cotton field, 6 or 7 of them, ever how many it was. And they'd count the rows. And then they'd divide it by 7. This uncle of mine, he'd sit under a shade tree while everybody else was chopping or picking cotton, whatever the case might be, making up songs about those who were working. What did they do? Well, they did what they shouldn't have done. They should have jumped on him and beat him up, but they didn't. They count the rows again, divide them again. Here he is over here under the shade tree making up poems and songs and things of that sort. One of the sisters got fed up with it. She said, I'm going to tell Papa when we get to the house. You know what my uncle said? That won't do any good. Papa won't do anything. And Papa wouldn't have. Because this man was next to the youngest, if that has any value toward it at all. But it just shows that Ruth was diligent in taking care of not just herself, but Naomi. And then you have people out here in the world, that old saying, there's a piece of paper that's in the floor over there. It's been there for 2 weeks. Well, that's not in my job description. I work this computer. I ain't gonna pick up any paper because that doesn't describe me. But you know some people that they don't worry about a job description. If they see something that needs to be done, they're gonna do it. That, to me, that defines Ruth. And she understood full well the things that Naomi had been through. As if Naomi had not had enough difficulties in life to have to turn around and have a great concern, but what are we going to do when we get back to the city of Bethlehem, Judah?
That uncle never had a cotton stalk over it.
Do what?
An uncle had never had a cotton stalk over it.
No. No, it didn't.
And he used to, people would bull bowls. I know a lot of these guys said they bull bowls, put them on the front porch. And the one time they picked the cotton out.
Yeah, yeah.